The foreclosure notice arrived before dawn, nailed to the ranch gate with a date that didn't exist on any calendar Elena had ever filed. 3 days early. 3 days that meant the difference between due process and manufactured default, between a family's legacy and a holding company's ledger. Cole Whitmore found it first, his sunburned hands trembling not with fear but with recognition, something in the wrongness of that date triggering a memory he had buried beneath worn boots and trailer park silence. He worked maintenance here for wages that couldn't buy a single hour of the legal counsel already assembling in Preston Valle's glass-walled office across town, yet he spoke of filing deadlines and statutory periods with the precision of a man who had once depended on such knowledge for survival. Elena Sutter discovered the same anomaly hours later, her fingers tracing the index card that shouldn't exist in the county records basement where she fought to keep her father's medical bills from swallowing them both. Their paths crossed in the dust between the archives and the ranch, two people who couldn't afford to be seen together yet couldn't afford to separate, drawn by a debt that wasn't theirs but would destroy them both. Preston Vale had already begun watching, his retaliation machine greased and ready, because some truths can only be spoken by those with nothing left to lose. What happens when the only witness to a crime has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when love becomes dangerous enough to risk everything? Dawn broke over the Caldera Ranch with the kind of light that makes everything look like evidence, harsh and unforgiving, revealing every crack in the fence line and every desperation in the faces of the hands who gathered at the main gate. Cole Whitmore stood apart from the others, his worn boots planted in dust that had been his only constant for 18 months, his steady gaze fixed on the paper nailed to the ironwork with a heavy-gauge staple that spoke of permanence, of intent, of someone who wanted this message to withstand weather and time and hope. The notice itself was professionally printed, embossed with the seal of Vale Agricultural Holdings, announcing foreclosure proceedings scheduled to commence on a date that Cole knew with absolute certainty had been manipulated, shifted forward, manufactured in the gap between legal and lethal. He didn't touch the paper, didn't need to, because he had seen its twin 3 years ago in another county, another ranch, another life he no longer claimed, and the recognition sat in his chest like a stone he had thought had finished drowning with. The other hands muttered about lawyers they couldn't afford, about hearings they wouldn't be given time to attend, about the rich man's clock that always seemed to run faster when you were poor and slower when you needed justice to hurry. Cole said nothing, only watched the way the morning sun caught the watermark on the notice, a detail that shouldn't matter, a detail that would matter enormously to someone trained to notice what others ignored, and he felt the old instincts waking like a muscle memory he had sworn to suppress. Elena Sutter would find this same notice 6 hours later when she drove out to verify chain-off title for a routine records request, her kind face drawn with the exhaustion of another night calculating whether her father's next treatment could wait another week, her patience worn thin by a system that demanded precision from the powerless while forgiving carelessness in the powerful. She photographed the gate, the notice, the impossible date, her smart mind already constructing the timeline that didn't align, the discrepancy that shouldn't exist, the first thread of something that would unravel everything if pulled with sufficient courage. The ranch hands had dispersed by then, back to work that wouldn't save their jobs, back to trailers that wouldn't survive the winter if the foreclosure held, back to the silence of people who had learned that observation could be as dangerous as action in a town owned by Vale Holdings. Cole watched her from the equipment barn, his careful words unspoken, his hidden purpose stirring like something dangerous and necessary, and he knew that the woman with the camera had just become either his greatest ally or the witness who would expose what he had spent years concealing. What happens when the first person to believe you is also the last person you can afford to trust? The county records basement smelled of mold and official indifference, a climate-controlled vault where the history of land and debt sat in metal drawers that required muscle to open and patience to search, qualities that Elena possessed in abundance but that the world rarely rewarded. She had returned to her station after the ranch visit with the photograph burning in her pocket, the wrong date scratching at her concentration while she processed routine requests for developers and lawyers and the occasional desperate homeowner trying to prove ownership against a bank's claim. The index cards were supposed to be comprehensive, cross-referenced, infallible, a system designed in the 1950s and maintained with decreasing funds and increasing cynicism by a county that had long ago decided that archives were a luxury rather than a protection against fraud. Elena worked the evening shift alone, her father's medical bills a constant whisper in her ear about the overtime she needed, the second job she couldn't take because someone had to be here when the lawyers came with their rush requests and their implied threats about whose projects deserved priority treatment. She found it at 9:47 p.m., a card that had slipped behind the drawer mechanism, wedged in metal older than her father, bearing a deed transfer from 1987 that had never been catalogued, never indexed, never entered into the digital system that now governed all property transactions in the county. The document described a parcel adjacent to the Caldera Ranch, a 40-acre wedge that shouldn't exist as separate from the main holding, conveyed to a corporation that had dissolved in 1992, leaving the title in a limbo that no title search would ever reveal because no title search would ever know to look. Alina's quietly fierce nature woke fully then, the part of her that had fought insurance companies for her father's care, that had learned to read the gaps in bureaucracy as clearly as the text, that understood that some absences were louder than presence. She cross-referenced against the foreclosure notice, against the Vail Holdings portfolio maps she had seen in previous filings, against the pattern of acquisitions that had been accelerating through the county like a disease that killed slowly and bought the land cheap from the bereaved. The missing deed connected to the wrong date on the gate like a key fitting a lock she hadn't known existed, and she sat in the fluorescent hum of the basement with the knowledge that she held either proof of fraud or proof of her own professional incompetence, depending on who told the story and who controlled the telling. Cole Whitmore appeared at the basement window at 10:15 p.m., his sunburned face ghostly in the security light, his steady gaze meeting hers through glass that separated the official world from the world of trailers and maintenance sheds and debts that couldn't be paid with money. He didn't knock, didn't signal, only stood there with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for moments when the powerful weren't watching, and Elena felt the first dangerous spark of recognition, the sense that this man understood what she had found without needing to be told. She let him in through the loading door, breaking protocol for the first time in her career, and the romance that would threaten everything began not with touch but with shared fear, with the understanding that some truths could only be spoken in places the cameras didn't reach. What price would she pay for the first right choice she had made in years? Preston Vail conducted his buyout meeting in the conference room of the Caldera Ranch's main house, a space that had hosted cattle negotiations for 3 generations now repurposed for corporate theater, the long table set with catered lunches that cost more than most hands earned in a week. He wore his charisma like bespoke armor, greeting each worker by name with the memory of a politician and the sincerity of a man who had never depended on the wages he controlled, his wealthy director's ease filling the room with the implicit promise that cooperation would be rewarded and resistance would be unwise. The presentation was polished, professional, reassuring Vail Holdings would modernize operations, preserve jobs, honor the ranch's heritage while bringing it into the efficiency of contemporary agribusiness, a narrative that sounded like salvation to ears accustomed to hearing only threats from the powerful. Cole sat in the back row, his worn boots leaving dust on the carpet that some future maintenance worker, perhaps himself if he survived, would be ordered to clean, his careful words held behind teeth that had learned to keep secrets through pain and necessity. He watched Preston's eyes, not his mouth, because the eyes moved too quickly over certain faces, cataloging rather than connecting, calculating the cost of each human unit against the value of the land beneath their feet. The cuts began in the parking lot afterward, whispered conversations with the oldest hands, the ones with medical conditions, the ones who had asked questions during the presentation, the ones whose trailers sat on the most developable portions of the property if the holding company decided to subdivide. Preston's ruthlessness wore the mask of regret, each termination framed as unfortunate necessity, market forces, the harsh mathematics of survival that somehow always required the poorest to sacrifice first while the wealthy adjusted portfolios. Elena heard about it from a crying clerk at the county office, a woman whose husband had worked the Caldera fences for 22 years and now carried a severance check that wouldn't cover 2 months of Cobra health insurance, let alone the mortgage that Vail Holdings already held notes on. The pattern was visible then, clear as the missing deed card Elena had hidden in her desk, a choreography of pressure designed to clear the land of human obstacles before the legal questions could be fully examined, before anyone could ask why the foreclosure date didn't match the court filings. Cole found the first retaliation notice tacked to his trailer door that evening, a performance review scheduled for 6 a.m. the following morning, a time that guaranteed he would either miss it and forfeit his position or attend it exhausted from working through the night to finish repairs that suddenly needed urgent completion. He understood the mechanism perfectly, had seen it deployed in other counties against other witnesses, and he knew that Preston Vale had identified him as something other than what he appeared, even if the identification remained incomplete, a suspicion rather than a certainty. The workplace retaliation had begun with the precision of a machine built for this purpose, and Cole stood in the dark of his single room with the knowledge that his hidden identity was becoming harder to maintain with each passing day, each necessary intervention, each choice between silence and action. How long could a man pretend to be powerless when the powerful had already begun to fear him? The payroll deduction appeared on the stub Cole received bi-weekly, a code he didn't recognize attached to an amount that represented 3 days' wages, labeled debt recovery advanced in a font that suggested official legitimacy while describing financial impossibility. He had never taken an advance, never borrowed against future earnings, never signed the documents that would authorize such a transaction, yet here was the proof that he owed, the mechanism that would justify termination if he complained, the planted detail that would support a narrative of employee theft if he resisted. Cole studied the code in the fluorescent light of his trailer, his sunburned skin tight with the anger he had learned to control, his steady gaze fixed on numbers that connected to a system he had spent years mapping from the outside, never expecting to see from within. The code matched a series he had encountered in his previous life, a tracking system used by holding companies to create paper trails of obligation where none existed, to manufacture consent through manufactured debt, to transform workers into debtors and debtors into disposable labor with no legal recourse. He traced the deduction through the ranch's accounting office, a converted tack room now staffed by Vale Holdings personnel who looked at him with the blank professionalism of people trained to see requests as disruptions and disruptions as threats to their own precarious security. The explanation he received was circular, bureaucratic, designed to exhaust the advance had been authorized by previous management, the records were being consolidated, the debt was valid until proven otherwise, and proof would require legal representation that cost more than the debt itself. Elena found him in the records basement that night, her kind face showing the strain of her own day's discoveries, her smart mind immediately recognizing the code from a previous employer's bankruptcy filing she had processed, a case where similar debts had been used to strip workers of severance claims. They sat on the floor between filing cabinets, two people who couldn't afford restaurants, sharing gas station sandwiches and the growing certainty that the Caldera Ranch was being harvested for more than its land, that the workers were being processed through a machine designed to leave them owing even as they lost everything. Cole spoke carefully, choosing each word for its deniability, describing the deduction code in terms that suggested educated suspicion rather than insider knowledge, watching Elena's patient, quietly fierce nature wake to the pattern he was sketching. She pulled the missing deed card from her desk, laid it beside his pay stub, and the connection became visible. The same corporate entity that had received the unrecorded land transfer in 1987 was listed as the creditor on his manufactured debt, a ghost company feeding on the living tissue of the ranch and its people. The unpaid debt was the weapon and the proof, the mechanism of control and the evidence of fraud, and they held it between them like something explosive that could destroy their enemies or themselves depending on how it was handled. What happens when the only leverage you have is also the only evidence that could get you killed? Elena sat in the county records parking lot at midnight, her father's latest medical bill spread across her steering wheel, the numbers blurring with tears she refused to let fall completely, the moral test she had been dreading finally arriving in full force. She had found the discrepancy, the missing deed, the wrong date, the manufactured debt, all the elements of a fraud that could stop the foreclosure and save the ranch and the people who depended on it, including the maintenance hand with the steady gaze who had somehow become necessary to her in ways she couldn't afford to examine. Reporting it meant protocols, investigations, publicity. The full attention of Vale Holdings turned upon her with the resources of a wealthy director against a county librarian drowning in medical debt, her father's care hanging in the balance of every choice she made. Preston Vale had already visited the archives once, unannounced, charming the supervisors with promises of funding for digitization projects while his eyes had swept the basement with the calculation of a man identifying vulnerabilities, and Elena had felt the threat implicit in his presence, the understanding that her job existed at the pleasure of people like him. Staying silent meant the foreclosure would proceed, the cuts would continue, Cole would lose his trailer and his precarious employment and perhaps the hidden purpose that kept him anchored to this place despite wages that couldn't sustain him, and the land would pass into the portfolio of a company that manufactured debt the way other companies manufactured grain. She thought of her father, of the treatments he needed, of the insurance that would disappear if she lost her county position, of the private counsel Vale could afford versus the public defender she would be assigned if charges were fabricated against her, the rich versus poor arithmetic that governed justice in this county. The romance she had been denying, the tenderness that had grown in shared fear and late-night discovery, seemed suddenly like a luxury she couldn't afford, a vulnerability that Preston would exploit if he learned of it, a handle for pressure that would make her choices even more impossible. Cole appeared at her car window, his worn boots silent on the asphalt, his careful words unspoken until she lowered the glass and the night air carried the smell of dust and desperation between them. He didn't ask what she was deciding, didn't pressure or persuade, only stood there with the presence of someone who understood that moral tests couldn't be shared, only witnessed, and in that witnessing offered the only support he could without compromising her autonomy. Elena made her choice at 12:47 a.m., the time she would remember later as the moment she stopped being a victim of circumstance and became an agent of consequence, reporting the discrepancy through channels that created official record while protecting her identity, filing the first documents that would begin the unraveling. She drove home to check on her father, to pay the bill that would keep his treatment current for another month, to carry the weight of a decision that had already begun changing everything, and she didn't see Cole's steady gaze following her taillights with an expression that mixed pride and terror in equal measure. What had she just set in motion, and who would be destroyed when it finally arrived? The county archives closed at 6 p.m., but Elena had keys she wasn't supposed to copy, skills she had acquired during years of overtime and underpayment, a determination that had grown from quietly fierce to something that bordered on recklessness as the investigation she had initiated began generating the retaliation she had feared. Cole found her there at 11 p.m., not by accident but by the pattern they had established without discussing it, the mutual recognition of two people who could only breathe freely in spaces the powerful didn't think to monitor. The basement was different at night, the fluorescent hum deeper, the shadows longer, the sense of being buried alive with history somehow comforting rather than oppressive when shared with someone who understood the weight of what they were trying to lift. They worked side by side in silence for an hour, Elena tracing chain-off title through decades of transactions while Cole reviewed payroll records he had copied with the careful precision of a man who knew how to acquire evidence without leaving traces, his sunburned hands steady even as the stakes grew higher with each document. The tenderness between them had been building for weeks, born of shared fear and mutual respect and the particular intimacy of people who have seen each other's vulnerabilities and chosen not to exploit them, and tonight it broke through the surface with the inevitability of water finding its level. He touched her hand first, a brush of knuckles against knuckles while reaching for the same file, and she didn't pull away, and the romance that had been threatening became real in the space between one breath and the next. They talked then, really talked, about fathers and debts and the choices that define lives, Cole speaking with the careful wording that hinted at depths he couldn't yet reveal, Elena sharing the medical bills she had hidden from everyone, the drowning feeling of love mixed with impending loss. The liability of their connection became immediately apparent even as they couldn't deny it, the understanding that Preston Vala's machine would use this against them if discovered, that love under threat was both their greatest strength and their most exploitable weakness. They made plans in whispers, strategies for protecting each other when the retaliation escalated, promises that felt like vows in the fluorescent hum of the archives, and when they finally touched with intention it was with the desperation of people who knew this might be the only honest night they would be allowed. Elena fell asleep against his shoulder at 3 a.m., her smart mind finally exhausted, her kind face relaxed in a way he had never seen, and Cole held her with the controlled anger of a man who had already lost much and would not lose this without consuming everything in his path. He left before dawn, back to his trailer and his maintenance duties and his hidden purpose, but something had shifted permanently, and they both knew that the fight ahead would be fought differently now, with something to lose that mattered more than justice or survival alone. What would they sacrifice to protect the only tenderness they had found in years of struggle? The retaliation arrived with the efficiency of a system designed for this purpose, not random or emotional but calculated, legalistic, documented in ways that would survive any subsequent review by authorities who had already been cultivated by Vale Holdings' influence network. The surprise inspection came first, county health and safety officials arriving at the Caldera Ranch with a warrant obtained through channels that moved faster than Elena's official complaint, their checklist seemingly designed to find violations in any working environment where poverty had dictated maintenance priorities over compliance perfection. Cole watched them measure, photograph, site, his steady gaze recording everything while his careful words remained minimal, knowing that any defense he offered would be quoted in the report that would justify his termination. Any resistance would be characterized as hostility toward legitimate authority. They found the safety violation in the equipment barn, a chemical storage arrangement that had been compliant for a decade suddenly reclassified as hazardous, the fine calculated to exceed 3 months of his wages, the correction order requiring immediate expenditure that would require borrowing against future earnings that might not exist. The write-ups followed, performance reviews citing attitude problems that hadn't existed in previous evaluations, attendance issues manufactured from the overtime he had been required to work, a paper trail of employee deficiency that would support termination for cause rather than the layoff that might trigger unemployment benefits. Elena faced parallel pressure at the county archives, her supervisors suddenly concerned about her overtime hours, her access to sensitive documents, her judgment in pursuing what they characterized as a personal vendetta against a major local employer who funded county initiatives through tax revenue and charitable contributions. Preston Vale didn't appear personally, didn't need to, his weaponized workplace retaliation operating through intermediaries who could claim good faith while executing instructions that arrived through channels too indirect to trace, the smear campaign beginning with whispers that reached her father's doctors, her neighbors, the creditors who held her survival in their calculations. The staged violation was the masterpiece, a narrative constructed so that any defense would sound like excuse, any protest like paranoia, the power of the wealthy to define reality through documentation that the poor couldn't afford to challenge. Cole and Elena met in a gap between these assaults, in a diner where the coffee was cheap and the surveillance was assumed, comparing notes on the machinery arrayed against them, recognizing that their romance had become visible enough to target, that their late-night archive sessions had been noticed, that the liability of their connection was being exploited with surgical precision. They held hands under the table, the only privacy available, and planned their countermoves with the desperation of people who understood that the system was designed to exhaust them into submission, to make the cost of truth higher than the benefit of justice. What remained when the powerful had taken your job, your reputation, your safety, and still you refused to surrender? The ranch office safe had been installed by previous management, a combination lock model that Cole had serviced twice during his maintenance tenure, each time noting the contents without appearing to note them, each time adding to the map of evidence he was constructing without revealing his true capabilities. The sealed envelope appeared on a Thursday, addressed to J. Harlan, ESQ in a handwriting that matched no current employee, bearing a return address for a law firm that had dissolved in 2019, containing documents that shouldn't exist in this place at this time. Cole found it during a routine safety inspection he had been ordered to conduct, his sunburned hand steady as he photographed the exterior without opening it, his careful mind immediately recognizing the significance of an envelope addressed to someone who doesn't exist in any directory, any bar association, any record accessible to normal inquiry. He didn't take it, couldn't without triggering alarms he wasn't prepared to manage, but he noted the date stamp, the postage marks, the precise positioning that would reveal if it was moved, and he understood that this was the planted detail that would pay off later, the evidence that would connect threads he had been gathering for years. Elena verified the address that night, her patient research through digital archives and microfiche records revealing that J. Harlan had been the attorney of record for the 1987 land transfer, the missing deed, the corporate entity that had received the 40-acre wedge and then dissolved without ever paying taxes or filing required reports. The lawyer had died in 2015, his files scattered, his legacy reduced to this single envelope sitting in a ranch safe, waiting for someone with the knowledge to recognize its value and the courage to retrieve it against the surveillance that now covered every movement at the Caldera property. They planned the extraction for the following Tuesday, when Vale Holdings executives would be in the city for a board meeting, when security would be relaxed, when Cole's maintenance access would allow him to reach the safe without triggering the logs that recorded every entry. The romance between them had become operational, their love expressed in coded messages and synchronized schedules, their tenderness now a tactical asset that gave them reason to communicate without appearing to conspire, to meet without appearing to plot. Elena would create a diversion at the county office, a records request that would require supervisory attention and pull eyes away from the ranch, while Cole would retrieve the envelope and replace it with a facsimile that would buy them time if its absence was discovered. The plan carried risks they couldn't fully calculate, variables they couldn't control, the possibility that Preston Vale had anticipated this move and prepared a trap that would finally expose them both, but the alternative was to let the foreclosure proceed, the land transfer complete, the debt manufacturing continue into other counties, other lives, other losses they couldn't bear to imagine. They kissed goodbye at the archive's door with the desperation of people who had learned that every honest moment might be their last, and Elena drove home to her father with the envelope's potential burning in her mind like a promise of deliverance or destruction. What would be found inside that could justify the risks they were taking, and who had placed it there to be found? The boardroom occupied the top floor of Vale Holdings' regional office, glass walls overlooking the town that had been assembled to serve interests like Preston's, the long tables set with water glasses and notepads and the implicit violence of spaces where decisions were made that would destroy lives without the deciders ever witnessing the destruction. Elena had been summoned through official channels, a request for clarification of her records complaint that had somehow become a mandatory appearance before the holding company's legal team, her county supervisor escorting her with the embarrassed silence of someone who had been informed where their loyalty must now lie. She wore her best professional clothes, bought for interviews she had never secured, drowning in medical bills that made every purchase a calculation of survival, her kind face composed in the expression she used for difficult patrons and demanding attorneys, her smart mind racing through scenarios of defense and escape. Preston Vale sat at the head of the table, his wealthy director's ease undisturbed by her presence, his charismatic mask fixed in place as he introduced the assembled lawyers and investigators and company officials who would witness what was about to occur, the choreography of silence already established through glances and positioning that made clear who would speak and who would listen and who would be destroyed. The accusation came from the legal director, a woman with the cold precision of someone who had delivered such speeches many times, her voice describing theft of company documents, tampering with official records, conspiracy to interfere with lawful business activities, the words landing like physical blows that Elena felt in her stomach, her throat, her capacity to breathe. They displayed photographs of her with Cole, entering the archives at night, the sealed envelope in her hand in a frame grab from security footage she hadn't known existed, the manufactured narrative of her as mastermind and him as accomplice, the reversal of their actual roles that would be believed because Preston's machine had constructed it and his machine was believed. The public humiliation unfolded with the inevitability of theater, each player delivering lines that had been rehearsed, Elena's attempts to explain met with documentary evidence that had been edited, signatures that had been forged, a case so professionally assembled that her truth sounded like desperate invention against its weight. Cole watched from the corner where maintenance staff had been positioned to witness the consequences of interference, his steady gaze fixed on Elena with an agony he couldn't express, his hidden identity preventing him from speaking, from defending, from revealing that he knew exactly how this machine operated because he had once been part of its construction. Preston choreographed the final moments personally, offering Elena a choice that wasn't a choice: immediate termination and criminal referral, or a signed statement naming Cole as the instigator, the planner, the thief, the exchange of love for survival presented with the sadistic gentleness of a man who enjoyed watching moral tests fail. She looked at Cole then, across the space that separated the powerful from the disposable, and saw in his eyes the message he couldn't speak, the permission he couldn't give, the understanding that her choice must be her own even as every option led to different forms of destruction. What would survive this room, and what would be sacrificed to buy the time they still needed? Cole moved through the aftermath of the boardroom with the controlled precision of a man who had learned to function while broken, his maintenance duties providing cover for movements that now carried the weight of Elena's survival as well as his hidden purpose, the unpaid debt ledger becoming his sole focus in the hours when he should have been sleeping. The humiliation had been public, complete, designed to isolate Elena from any support network that might have offered protection, and it had worked. Her county position suspended, her father moved to a cheaper care facility, her name circulating through the town in whispers that attached criminality to her kindness, that transformed her patience into cunning and her fierceness into malice. Preston Vale had tightened the noose with professional satisfaction, the retaliation now escalated to legal prosecution, the machinery of a wealthy director's influence grinding through district attorney offices and judicial assignments and media relationships that would ensure the narrative he had constructed became the only narrative visible. Cole traced the manufactured debt through accounting systems he accessed with skills he shouldn't possess, following the deduction code to subsidiary ledgers, to offshore holdings, to the corporate entity that had received the 1987 land transfer and had been feeding on the Caldera Ranch ever since, a hidden creditor chain that explained everything and proved nothing without the documentation he was still seeking. He worked with the awareness that his trailer was now under surveillance, his phone monitored, his movements tracked by the same system that had manufactured Alina's guilt, and he used counter-surveillance techniques that hinted at training no maintenance hand should have, careful wording in any communication that might be intercepted, restrained reactions to provocations designed to trigger the anger he kept locked behind his steady gaze. Alina had refused to name him, had chosen criminal referral over betrayal, and that choice sat in his chest like a burning brand that demanded repayment in justice rather than mere survival, that transformed his hidden mission into something personal and immediate and non-negotiable. The ledger entries he found connected Preston directly to the debt manufacturing, not through signature but through authorization codes, through timing, through the pattern of acquisitions that required the foreclosure to proceed on the wrong date that had started everything, the rich man's clock running faster to beat the discovery of his fraud. Cole copied everything, photographed everything, constructed the chain of proof that would survive any single piece being seized or destroyed, and he understood that he was no longer maintaining cover but preparing for exposure, that the identity he had concealed for years would soon be necessary to deploy. What would be revealed when the man in worn boots finally spoke with the voice he had been suppressing, and would anyone believe what he had to say? The immunity offer arrived through Alina's public defender, a young attorney drowning in caseload who recognized the manufactured nature of the charges but lacked the resources to challenge the evidence that Vail Holdings had assembled, his voice conveying the deal with the embarrassed resignation of someone who had learned that justice and convenience rarely aligned for the poor. The prosecutor would drop all charges, seal the record, restore her county position with back pay, ensure her father's return to proper care, in exchange for a single signed statement identifying Cole Whitmore as the mastermind who had manipulated her, used her position, planned the document theft she had been accused of committing. The love that had grown between them in archives and fear became suddenly a commodity, a bargaining chip, the romance under threat transformed into a transaction where her survival could be purchased with his destruction, the moral test she had faced before now returned with compound interest and the explicit price tag she had always dreaded. She sat in the interview room with the offer spread before her like a contract with the devil written in the language of bureaucratic mercy, her smart mind calculating the evidence she knew versus the evidence they claimed, her kind face showing the strain of a choice that would define not just her future but her capacity to live with herself. Cole had prepared her for this possibility without ever discussing it directly, his careful words during their last meeting carrying the coded message that she must survive, must protect her father, must not sacrifice herself for a truth that might never emerge if they both were destroyed, and she understood that he was offering himself as the price of her deliverance. Preston Vail had designed this offer personally, she knew, the sadism of the wealthy expressed in the precision with which he had identified her vulnerability and weaponized it, the scapegoating mechanism that would place all blame on the maintenance hand while the holding company continued its acquisitions, its debt manufacturing, its consumption of the county's future. She thought of the boardroom, of the choreography of her humiliation, of the way Cole's steady gaze had held hers across the space that separated them, offering silent support he couldn't express aloud, and she understood that accepting this deal would be a second humiliation worse than the first, a self-inflicted wound that would never heal. The offer expired in 48 hours, the pressure designed to force decision before reflection, before consultation, before the emergence of any evidence that might challenge the narrative she was being asked to endorse, and Alina sat with the pen in her hand knowing that either choice would cost her something she couldn't replace. What kind of love survives when one survival requires the other's destruction, and what kind of person emerges from such a choice? The key witness emerged from the county's forgotten history, a retired title examiner named Morris who had processed the 1987 transfer and remembered the irregularity that had bothered him enough to make private notes, his emergence triggered by Alina's suspended case and the rumors that had reached him through channels that still valued truth over employment security. He contacted her through the public defender, an old man with shaking hands and a memory that remained precise, offering testimony that would connect the missing deed to Preston Valle's predecessor company, establishing the chain of fraud that stretched across decades and acquisitions and the systematic erasure of records that had prevented previous challenges. Cole learned of the witness through Alina's coded message, a reference to the librarian's special collection that told him everything he needed to know, and he understood that Morris represented either salvation or trap, that key witnesses in cases like this had a tendency to recant under pressure, to disappear, to suffer health crises that prevented testimony at crucial moments. The pressure began immediately. Morris assisted living facility receiving notice of code violations that threatened closure, his adult children facing employment reviews at companies owned by Vail Holdings subsidiaries, the machinery of retaliation extending to touch everyone connected to the truth that threatened Preston's acquisition timeline. Elena watched it happen with the helpless fury of someone who had learned that power meant the capacity to punish without leaving fingerprints, who saw the convenience of silence being manufactured through the targeted suffering of anyone who might speak. And she understood that truth versus convenience was not an abstract moral test but a daily warfare waged in medical bills and housing security and the basic capacity to exist without fear. The town began to split along predictable lines, those with something to lose finding reasons to doubt Morris' memory, to question Elena's motives, to accept the narrative that protected their own precarious positions, while those with nothing left to lose began to gather, to whisper, to remember other foreclosures with wrong dates and other workers with manufactured debts and other land transfers that had disappeared into corporate shells. Cole moved among these divisions with the careful neutrality of his maintenance role, his steady gaze recording everything, his hidden identity preventing him from leading or directing but allowing him to feed information, to suggest connections, to prepare the ground for the moment when his own testimony would become possible and necessary. Morris recanted on a Tuesday, his statement to investigators withdrawing his previous claims, citing confusion, age, pressure from family members who had been threatened with financial ruin, and the case against Elena lost its most powerful external support, leaving her more isolated than before, more dependent on the immunity offer she had not yet accepted. What remained when the witnesses were silenced and the evidence was hidden and the powerful had manufactured consensus through fear? The debt trail led Cole through records he accessed with methods he couldn't explain, through corporate filings in jurisdictions that specialized in opacity, through the chain of title that revealed the hidden creditor as a subsidiary of a trust that ultimately traced to Preston Valle's personal holdings, the land grab depending on a single lie that had been told so often it had become administrative fact. He found the original loan documents, the 1987 transaction that had created the debt from nothing, a signature forged, a notary bribed, a filing fee paid from an account that no longer existed, the mechanism of fraud exposed in its full elegant simplicity: create obligation where none existed, then enforce it through courts that believed documents over people. The revelation changed everything and nothing, because proof that couldn't be presented legally was merely dangerous knowledge, and Cole understood that the public legal power reversal they needed required not just evidence but a mechanism to force that evidence into official recognition, a court order or regulatory intervention that couldn't be ignored or buried. Elena worked from her suspension, using access she still possessed through colleagues who hadn't yet abandoned her, verifying Cole's discoveries through official channels that created parallel records, building the case that would survive if something happened to either of them, the romance now expressed entirely in shared work and mutual protection. They met once during this period, in a location so public it was private, a county fair where the crowds and noise provided cover for conversation that couldn't be intercepted, their hands touching briefly under a table while they exchanged USB drives and whispered strategies, their love transformed into operational necessity and thus, paradoxically, strengthened rather than diminished by the impossibility of ordinary tenderness. Preston Vail sensed the danger without knowing its precise form, his wealthy director's instincts recognizing that the pressure he had applied had not produced the submission he expected, that Elena had not accepted immunity, that Cole had not been exposed as criminal, that something was building beneath the surface of his controlled narrative. He accelerated the foreclosure, moved the land transfer date forward, applied for final judicial approval with the urgency of a man who knew that time was no longer his ally, and the race between discovery and destruction entered its final phase with stakes that included not just the ranch but the principle that truth could still prevail against manufactured debt and orchestrated silence. Cole prepared his own exposure, the identity reveal that would explain his knowledge and authorize his testimony, the shock that would reframe everything that had been assumed about the maintenance hand in worn boots, and he did so with the controlled anger of someone who had waited years for this moment while fearing what it would cost. What would happen when the man who had been hiding finally stepped into the light, and would the light reveal a hero or merely another victim of the system he had tried to escape? Cole's coincidences had always been too precise, too timely, Too informed for a man with his official biography, and Preston Valles investigators finally assembled enough of these anomalies to test what the maintenance hand would testify to if properly pressured, if presented with the right combination of threat and opportunity. They approached him through intermediaries, a concerned citizen group offering support for his legal defense if he would simply clarify his role in the document acquisition, his relationship with Elena, his knowledge of corporate structures that no ranch hand should recognize, the questions designed to map the boundaries of his concealed capabilities. Cole answered with the careful wording that had become his signature, acknowledging nothing, denying nothing, presenting the blank surface of a man who had learned that survival meant becoming unreadable to those who would use any admission as leverage, his steady gaze giving away nothing while his mind calculated the exposure this interview represented. They offered money, more than he had earned in 2 years of maintenance work, enough to disappear, to start elsewhere, to abandon Elena and the ranch and the mission that had brought him to this place, the test of what he would testify to becoming also a test of what he would sacrifice for. He refused with the restraint that had become indistinguishable from coldness, and the investigators noted this, reported it, added it to the profile that suggested Cole Whitmore was not what he appeared, that his presence on the ranch served purposes that didn't match his paycheck, that the hidden identity they had suspected was approaching the moment of necessary revelation. Elena felt the pressure shift through the change in surveillance patterns, the sudden absence of offers, the silence that preceded storms, and she understood that Cole was being tested, that his responses would determine whether Preston moved to eliminate him or merely to discredit him, whether the final phase would be legal or something less formal. She prepared her own testimony, the statement she would give if given opportunity, documenting everything she knew about the debt manufacturing, the missing deed, the sealed envelope, the chain of fraud that connected decades of acquisitions, and she had copies and locations that would survive any search, any seizure, any attempt to silence her through the isolation of evidence. The romance between them had become entirely strategic, their communication reduced to signals and drops and the occasional glimpse across distances that couldn't be safely crossed, but the longing remained, the intimacy under pressure transformed into something harder and more durable than ordinary love, a connection forged in shared risk rather than shared comfort. Cole made his final preparations, the notebook with dated entries that would establish his timeline, the signature that would match the sealed envelope, the knowledge that would reframe every coincidence as evidence of systematic investigation rather than random luck, and he waited for the moment when Preston would force his hand, when the escalation would require response. What would be revealed when the maintenance hand finally spoke with the voice of the man he had been before, and would anyone be listening who could act on what they heard? The revelation came not through confession but through confrontation, Preston Valles' impatience finally overcoming his caution, a direct meeting demanded with the maintenance hand who had disrupted too many timelines, who knew too much, who refused to be bought or frightened into the silence that had contained every previous challenge to the holding company's operations. They met in the ranch office, the same room where the sealed envelope had waited, where Cole had retrieved it and replaced it and begun the chain of events that would end here, the wealthy director facing the poor ranch hand across a distance that had never been as wide as Preston assumed. Cole spoke first, his careful words dropping away like masks he no longer needed, his voice carrying the authority of legal training, of investigative experience, of years spent mapping the very fraud he had now exposed, the shock identity reveal unfolding not as surprise but as recognition, as the final piece of a puzzle that had been visible to anyone who looked closely enough. He was J. Harlan's son, the attorney of record who had died in 2015, the young lawyer who had discovered his father's complicity in the 1987 fraud and had spent the subsequent years building the case that would expose it, working maintenance on ranches targeted by Vail Holdings to gather evidence from within, to understand the machinery of debt manufacturing, to become the witness that could not be discredited because he had been present at the creation of the crime. The planted details paid off in sequence, the dated notebook entries that established his timeline of investigation, the signature on copies of documents that matched the sealed envelope's handwriting, the chain-off title anomaly that Elena had found and that he had been tracking since before she was assigned to the archives, every coincidence now revealed as systematic evidence gathering. Preston's face shifted through emotions he rarely experienced, the power reversal beginning in this room before it would spread to the public sphere, the wealthy director confronted by the poor hand who had never been poor, who had chosen poverty as cover and strategy and moral witness, who had sacrificed everything to be present at this moment of exposure. Cole produced the sealed envelope, opened it finally, displayed the original 1987 documents that proved the fraud, the debt that had never been valid, the land transfer that had been illegal from its inception, and he explained how every subsequent foreclosure, every manufactured obligation, every retaliation against workers and witnesses had flowed from this original sin that Preston had inherited and expanded. The controlled anger that had always been present beneath Cole's steady gaze finally found its appropriate target, not violent, not vengeful, but absolute in its determination that this would end, that the machinery would stop, that the unpaid debt would finally prove the truth rather than destroy it. Elena arrived with the legal team she had contacted through channels Cole had established, the public mechanism that would freeze the land transfer, initiate criminal referral, require court-ordered audit of every debt Vail Holdings had manufactured in the county, and the power reversal became official, irreversible, inscribed in filings that could not be buried or bought. What kind of justice is possible when the truth has been hidden for so long, and what scars remain on those who fought to reveal it? The filings hit the court system at 9 a.m. on a Thursday, injunctions and lease pendens notices and criminal referrals that had been prepared in parallel by attorneys who had finally found the witness they needed, the evidence they required, the case that could overcome the influence networks that had protected Vail Holdings for decades. Preston fell publicly with the speed of a man whose power had always been illusion, his wealthy director's mask stripped away by court orders that froze his assets, his acquisitions, his capacity to retaliate against those who had exposed him, the land grab that had consumed the Caldera Ranch and so many others finally halted by the legal mechanism that couldn't be brushed away. The town witnessed this reversal with the complex emotions of communities that had accommodated power and resented it in equal measure, some celebrating the justice that had seemed impossible, others mourning the economic stability that had depended on Valle's operations, most simply watching to see whether this victory would last or be reversed by appeals and delays and the infinite resources of the formerly wealthy. Elena stood in the courthouse lobby with her father's hand in hers, his care now secured through settlements that would provide for his remaining years, her county position restored with acknowledgement of the retaliation she had suffered, her kind face showing not triumph but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had chosen rightly when choosing rightly was hardest. Cole appeared in the sunlight through the courthouse doors, no longer in maintenance clothes but in the professional attire he had set aside years ago, his sunburned skin beginning to heal, his worn boots replaced but his steady gaze unchanged, carrying the same careful precision that had sustained him through the long concealment. Their romance, scarred by betrayal offers and public humiliation and the strategic necessities of survival, transformed in this moment into something they could finally acknowledge openly, love that had survived not despite the pressure but because of it, changed into a bond that didn't require secrecy or coded communication or the constant fear of exposure. The emotional scar remained, would always remain, the knowledge of what they had been forced to consider, the choices they had almost made, the price that had been paid by others who hadn't survived to see this day, and they carried it with the honesty of people who understood that justice was not healing but accountability, not restoration but prevention of future harm. The Caldera Ranch would survive, its workers reinstated, its debts invalidated, its future uncertain but no longer predetermined by the manufactured obligations of a holding company that had treated land and lives as interchangeable commodities in a portfolio. Cole and Elena walked out together into the afternoon, not toward a guaranteed happiness but toward the possibility of honest work and honest relationship and the ongoing struggle against the systems that would always tend toward the concentration of power in hands like Preston's, their love now a public fact as it had once been a secret strength. What does survival mean when it has been purchased with so much loss, and what responsibility comes with the victory that allows the fight to continue? Justice arrived with the cold satisfaction of a debt finally paid, not in celebration but in the quiet certainty that some accounts cannot be settled with money or power, only with the truth that outlasts both. Cole and Elena survived their transformation, scarred where they had been wounded, honest where they had been forced to lie, changed by a battle that proved love could endure under threat but never emerge unchanged from its testing. The Caldera Ranch stands now as proof that the machinery of exploitation can be stopped when those it would crush choose to resist together, its gates no longer bearing notices of manufactured default but opening to workers who know the price of their presence there. What happened to them matters because it happens still, in counties and companies and relationships where power concentrates and conscience must choose between convenience and courage, where the unpaid debts of the powerful await the witnesses willing to prove them false. If this story moved you, If you recognize the Alinas and Coles in your own community fighting battles that don't make headlines but make lives possible, leave your mark below, like this video, comment with the truth you've witnessed, share with someone who needs to remember that resistance is possible. Subscribe and enable notifications to join the next investigation, the next story of ordinary people discovering extraordinary strength when the alternative is surrender. The archives are full of records waiting for the right reader, the ranch is full of workers with stories they cannot yet tell, and we will continue to tell them until the machinery stops for good.